You are not leaving this table until you apologize to your sister, my mother. Vivian slammed her hand against the mahogany table so hard the crystal wine glasses trembled. I was 29 years old. I was a forensic accountant who spent my days untangling multi-million-dollar corporate fraud cases. Yet sitting in my childhood home on a Sunday evening, I was being disciplined like a disobedient toddler. My sister Chloe smirked casually, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet, while her husband Bradley let out a loud, condescending chuckle. "Come on," Nia Bradley drawled, leaning back in his custom-upholstered dining chair with all the unearned confidence of a mediocre hedge fund manager. "Just say you are sorry. We know your little bookkeeping job does not pay enough for you to contribute to the actual funeral costs, but a simple apology is completely free." I stared down at my plate, my jaw clenched so tight that my teeth ached. What the three of them did not know was that in exactly 10 minutes, the front door of this sprawling Atlanta estate would open. The family lawyer would step inside, and the massive financial empire they thought they had just inherited would come crashing down around their heads. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to sit in silence while toxic family members completely underestimated your worth. Growing up in our affluent neighborhood, my family was obsessed with the image of perfection. My mother Vivian was the reigning queen of her country club circle, a woman who measured human value strictly by zip codes, designer labels, and social connections. My sister Chloe was her absolute masterpiece. As a former pageant queen who now branded herself as a lifestyle investor, Chloe had never worked a hard day in her 33 years of life. She did not have to. She simply married Bradley, a white finance executive who loved playing the role of the wealthy savior in our prominent African-American family. Bradley constantly patronized me, entirely oblivious to the fact that his so-called high-level investment strategies were exactly the kind of basic financial crimes I investigated for federal agencies. The tension in the dining room was suffocating. We had just buried my grandfather Marcus the day before. Grandpa Marcus was a legend. He started with a single rusty delivery truck in the 1970s and built a logistics and transportation empire that was now worth tens of millions of dollars. He was the only person in this family who saw through my mother and sister. While Vivian was busy dragging Chloe to beauty pageants and etiquette classes, Grandpa Marcus was sneaking me out to the truck yards. He taught me how to read complex balance sheets, how to spot a lie in a profit and loss statement, and how to understand the true value of hard work. I loved the smell of engine oil and the reality of cold, hard numbers. Because of that, my mother labeled me the family failure. I was the dark cloud on her perfect sunny horizon because I chose a quiet corporate career over a flashy lifestyle. "Nia, I am speaking to you," my mother barked, pulling me back to the present moment. The Sunday dinner spread in front of us was lavish. Roast lamb, garlic asparagus, and truffled mashed potatoes sat untouched on fine china. Your grandfather's memorial service yesterday was a reflection of this family's standing in the community. It was supposed to be a flawless tribute to Black excellence. Instead, you embarrassed us. You refused to pay for the custom-imported floral arches Chloe designed, and you showed up wearing an off-the-rack suit. You made us look like we were struggling. I took a slow, deep breath, gripping my linen napkin under the table. I could have told them the truth. I could have told them that I personally paid for Grandpa Marcus's bronze casket out of my own savings, because the company accounts had mysteriously been drained of liquid cash. I could have told them that I covered the cemetery plot fees, while Chloe was busy arguing with a magazine photographer about her grieving angles. But I kept my mouth shut. I knew that arguing with my mother was like pouring gasoline on a wildfire. "Well," Bradley chimed in, picking up his wine glass and swirling the expensive red liquid. "You have to forgive her, Vivian. Nia just does not understand the corporate world or high society. When you are stuck crunching numbers in a cubicle all day, you lose touch with the bigger picture. Do not worry, Nia. Now that Chloe and I are taking over the logistics company, we might be able to find a little administrative role for you. Something simple. Maybe managing the payroll for the janitorial staff so you can afford a nicer suit next time." Chloe giggled, reaching over to pat Bradley on the arm. "You are so generous, babe. But seriously, Nia, you need to apologize. I worked so hard on those floral arrangements to honor Grandpa. You being so incredibly cheap was a slap in the face to his memory. It was humiliating for me to explain to my friends why my own sister was being so stingy during a time of grief. The sheer audacity of her words made my blood boil. Chloe had spent her entire adult life treating Grandpa Marcus like a personal ATM. She only visited his house when she needed a check for a luxury vacation or a down payment on a new sports car. Grandpa knew exactly who she was. In his final months, when his health was rapidly declining, I was the one who sat by his hospital bed. I was the one who reviewed his medical bills, brought him his favorite meals, and listened to his stories about the early days on the road. Chloe and Bradley only showed up when the doctors said he had less than a week to live, and even then they spent most of their visits whispering in the hallway about estate taxes. I looked at the three of them sitting around that grand table. My mother with her perfectly styled hair and cold, judgmental eyes, Chloe playing the delicate victim while calculating her upcoming inheritance, and Bradley the arrogant outsider who thought he had successfully infiltrated and conquered a wealthy family. They were so utterly confident in their victory. They had spent the entire morning discussing how they were going to liquidate Grandpa's trucking routes and sell the warehouses to a corporate developer. They had already mentally spent millions of dollars that did not belong to them. Nia. I will not ask you again, my mother said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Apologize to your sister right now, or you can pack your bags and leave this house tonight. You will not see a single dime from the estate until you learn some respect. I looked at my mother. Then I looked at Chloe and Bradley. A strange sense of absolute calm washed over me. I did not feel angry anymore. I just felt ready. I offered a small, polite smile. All right, I said softly. I am sorry, Chloe. I am sorry you felt embarrassed. Chloe smirked triumphantly, tossing her hair over her shoulder. Thank you. That was not so hard, was it? My mother nodded in satisfaction and picked up her fork. Good. Now that we have established some order, let us eat. We have a very busy week ahead of us. We need to meet with the real estate brokers on Tuesday to discuss selling the downtown property. They resumed eating instantly, shifting the conversation to their grand plans for the money. I simply sipped my water and watched them. I did not touch my food. I just counted the seconds in my head. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Right on cue, the heavy brass doorbell echoed through the massive house. The cheerful chimes cut sharply through Bradley's boasting about a new yacht he planned to buy. The dining room fell completely silent. Who could that be at this hour? My mother muttered, dabbing the corners of her mouth with a napkin. We are not expecting anyone. I will get it, I said, standing up from my chair before anyone else could move. I walked down the long, echoing hallway toward the grand foyer. When I opened the heavy oak front door, the cool evening air rushed in. Standing on the porch was Mr. Sterling, the senior partner at the most ruthless estate law firm in the state. He was a tall, imposing man with graying hair, dressed in a sharp three-piece suit despite the late hour. He held a thick leather briefcase tightly in his right hand. Good evening, Nia, Mr. Sterling said smoothly, his eyes sharp and serious. I apologize for the intrusion on a Sunday night, but your grandfather left very specific instructions regarding the timing of this visit. Right on time, Mr. Sterling, I replied, stepping aside to let him into the house. Please come into the dining room. The family is all here. Mr. Sterling walked past me with slow, measured steps. His expensive leather shoes clicked against the hardwood floor until he reached the archway of the dining room. My mother immediately stood up. She smoothed the front of her designer dress and plastered on her signature country club smile. Arthur, she said, using his first name to assert her dominance and familiarity. We were not expecting you until the formal reading at your office next week. Please sit down and have a glass of wine with us. We have plenty to celebrate tonight. Bradley stood up as well, extending a hand with that irritating frat boy grin he always wore. Good to see you, Sterling, Bradley said loudly. I am glad you are here. Chloe and I were just discussing the transition plan for the warehouses. We want to get the paperwork moving quickly so we can finalize the sale to the commercial developers by the end of the month. The market is hot right now, and we do not want to leave capital sitting around doing nothing. Mr. Sterling did not shake Bradley's hand. He did not accept my mother's offer of wine. He simply stood at the head of the long table, his posture stiff and strictly professional. He placed his heavy leather briefcase directly onto the fine mahogany surface, right next to the silver platter of untouched roast lamb. The metallic snap of the briefcase latch's opening echoed sharply in the quiet room. There will be no transition plan involving you, Bradley, Mr. Sterling said smoothly, pulling a thick stack of crisp legal documents from the case. And Vivian, there will be no formal reading at my office next week. Marcus left very specific, legally binding instructions that this document was to be executed exactly 48 hours after his burial in this very house with all immediate family members present. My mother frowned, her perfect smile slipping just a fraction. "What do you mean, this document?" she asked, her voice tight with sudden anxiety. "We already reviewed the estate plan last year. The properties and the logistics company are to be divided between Chloe and me. Naya gets a small cash stipend to help her out. That was all settled and notarized." Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses and looked down at the paperwork. "That was the previous estate plan," he corrected her without a trace of emotion. "Marcus quietly drafted and finalized an entirely new will 3 weeks before his passing. He had independent medical examiners present to certify his complete mental clarity. I am here tonight to execute the final and absolute testament of Marcus Theodore Vance." Chloe scoffed from her seat, crossing her arms over her chest and rolling her eyes. "Well, whatever he changed, it does not matter. Just read it so we can finish our dinner. I have a fitting for my new gala dress in the morning, and I need my beauty sleep." Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. He held the thick cream-colored paper up to the light. "To my daughter Vivian and my granddaughter Chloe, I leave a specialized trust fund. The liquid assets allocated to this trust will provide a strict monthly allowance of exactly $4,000 each. This allowance is conditional and will be managed exclusively by an independent third-party fiduciary at my law firm. You will have no access to the principal amount. You cannot borrow against it, and you cannot cash it out. Furthermore, you are expressly forbidden from utilizing any company assets, commercial properties, or corporate vehicles." The silence in the dining room was absolute and suffocating. You could hear a pin drop on the thick Persian rug. Chloe was the first to react. Her jaw literally dropped open. $4,000 a month, she shrieked, standing up so fast, her heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the floor. "Are you completely insane? My car payment and my personal trainer fees alone are $5,000 a month. That is poverty money. How am I supposed to maintain my lifestyle on $4,000? My mother looked like she had just been physically struck. She reached out and gripped the edge of the table, her manicured nails digging into the wood. "Arthur," she demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and pure rage. "This is a sick joke. My father built a $50 million empire from the ground up. Where is the rest of the money? Where are the deeds to the commercial real estate? Where is the controlling stake in the logistics company? We are his primary heirs." Mr. Sterling did not flinch at their screaming. He calmly turned the page of the document. "To my youngest granddaughter Nia, I leave the remaining bulk of my estate. This includes the deed to this primary family residence, all overseas investment portfolios, and most importantly, a 60% controlling interest in the logistics enterprise and all associated commercial properties. Effective immediately upon my death, Nia is appointed as the sole chief executive officer of the company with full unilateral authority over all business operations, liquidations, board appointments, and financial distributions." I stood quietly by the archway, my face completely blank, though my heart was pounding a steady, fierce rhythm against my ribs. I knew this was coming. Grandpa Marcus and I had spent countless hours going over the exact wording of this document in his private hospital room, while my mother and sister were out shopping for funeral outfits. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that my mother would squander his legacy on status symbols to impress her country club friends. He knew that Chloe would sell his life's work to the highest bidder just to fund her extravagant vacations. And most of all, he knew that Bradley was a parasite waiting to drain our family dry. Grandpa Marcus trusted me because I was the only one who respected the sweat and blood it took to build his empire. I was a forensic accountant. I knew how to protect the fortress. My mother sank slowly back into her chair, her face draining of all color. She looked back and forth between me and Mr. Sterling, her mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. She was completely and utterly paralyzed by the sudden, absolute loss of her power. She had spent her entire life controlling the narrative of this family, and in one swift legal move my grandfather had stripped her of everything. But Bradley was not paralyzed. Bradley was furious. The arrogant, composed facade he wore just 5 minutes ago completely shattered. His face turned a deep, blotchy shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk tie. He lunged forward and slammed his heavy fist onto the dining table. The impact was so violent that the crystal wine glasses tipped over, spilling dark, expensive red wine across the pristine white tablecloth. The red liquid dripped slowly onto the floor, looking exactly like fresh blood. "This is unbelievable," Bradley roared, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "It is a scam, a complete and utter fraud. She manipulated an old man who was suffering from dementia. She probably drafted that document herself and forced him to sign it on his deathbed when he did not know what day it was." Mr. Sterling looked up from the papers, his voice dropping to a dangerous warning tone. "I assure you Bradley Marcus was of perfectly sound mind. I have video documentation of the signing along with affidavits from 2 board-certified neurologists. Any attempt to contest this will be a massive waste of your time and resources." "I do not care about your fake doctors!" Bradley screamed, stepping away from the table and aggressively marching toward me. He stopped just inches from my face, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "You are not getting away with this, Nia. Do you hear me? I am a senior partner at a top-tier hedge fund. I have the most ruthless corporate litigators in the entire state on my personal payroll. I will file an emergency injunction tomorrow morning at exactly 8 a.m. I will freeze every single bank account, every single cargo truck, and every single piece of property your grandfather ever touched. I will tie this estate up in probate court for decades, until you are completely bankrupt and begging us for a settlement. You are out of your depth, little girl. You think you won because of a piece of paper. The game is just starting." Bradley stormed out of the dining room right after his little speech, dragging Chloe behind him. Mr. Sterling simply nodded at me, packed his briefcase, and left without another word. The massive house fell into a toxic, heavy silence. I went upstairs and locked my bedroom door. I knew exactly what was coming. I did not even bother changing into my pajamas. I pulled my 2 largest suitcases from the closet and started folding my clothes with methodical precision. I did not sleep a single wink that night. At exactly 6 in the morning, the heavy wooden door of my bedroom flew open. My mother stood in the doorway. She was already fully dressed, her makeup perfectly applied, looking every bit the ruthless matriarch she prided herself on being. "Get out!" she commanded, her voice cold and entirely devoid of any maternal warmth. I zipped up my second suitcase and stood up. I did not say a word. My mother grabbed one of my smaller duffel bags from the bed and literally hurled it down the grand staircase. I carried my heavy suitcases down myself, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me struggle or beg. When we reached the driveway, the crisp morning air bit at my skin. A few of our wealthy neighbors were already out walking their purebred dogs, pausing on the sidewalk to watch the spectacle. My mother did not care who saw. In fact, she wanted an audience to witness her righteous indignation. "You are a traitor to black excellence," she spat, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest. "We spent decades building a flawless reputation in this community. We are the pinnacle of success. And you, the resentful little underachiever, decided to poison your grandfather against us out of sheer jealousy. You are dead to me, Nia. Do not ever show your face at my country club or my church again. You are no longer my daughter." I looked at her standing there in the driveway of the house that legally belonged to me now. I did not cry, I did not scream back. I just loaded my bags into the trunk of my practical sedan. "Goodbye, Vivian," I said evenly, dropping the title of mother completely. "I will see you in the boardroom." I closed the trunk, got into the driver's seat, and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. The moment I pulled out of the gated community, my phone started vibrating violently against the center console. It did not stop for the next 30 minutes. I connected the Bluetooth and hit play on the first voicemail. It was my Aunt Denise, my mother's younger sister. "Nia, how could you do this to your own mother?" she shrieked through the car speakers. "She is grieving her father, and you manipulate him on his deathbed for a money grab. You disgust me." The next message was from my cousin Marcus Jr. "Hey Nia, Bradley just called me. He said you locked the family out of the trust. Are you crazy? Bradley is a finance genius. You are going to bankrupt the logistics company in a week. Turn the shares over to him before you ruin all of us." It was a masterclass in manipulation. In less than 12 hours, my mother and Bradley had spun a perfect, flawless narrative. I was the greedy, incompetent spinster who took advantage of an old man with a slipping mind. They played the victims flawlessly to our entire extended family. By noon, my own flesh and blood had entirely excommunicated me. I was receiving text messages calling me a thief, a disgrace, and a manipulator. I was completely alone. But being alone was exactly what I was used to. It was where I did my best work. I did not book a room at a luxury downtown hotel. I needed to preserve my personal savings because I knew a massive legal war was coming and corporate litigation was brutally expensive. Instead, I drove to the outskirts of the city and checked into a cheap roadside motel. The room smelled faintly of stale bleach and old cigarette smoke. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners, and the neon sign outside buzzed with an irritating electrical hum. It was a stark contrast to the imported Italian marble and Egyptian cotton sheets I had slept on the night before. But I did not care. I placed my laptop on the scratched wooden desk, pulled up the rickety chair, and cracked my knuckles. I was a forensic accountant. Give me a quiet room, a cup of terrible black coffee, and a high-speed internet connection, and I can dismantle an empire. I knew I could not access the company's internal private servers yet. Bradley had likely already instructed the IT department to lock out my credentials until the court stepped in. But Bradley was arrogant. He assumed that because I did not work in his flashy high-stakes world of hedge funds, I did not know how to dig. He forgot that public filings exist, and that they tell a story if you know how to read the language of numbers. I opened the state business registry and the federal transportation databases. I pulled up every publicly available quarterly report, tax lien fleet registration, and UCC filing for Marcus Logistics Incorporated over the past 4 years. For the first 2 hours, everything looked relatively normal on the surface. Gross revenue was steady. The number of active cargo trucks on the road had slightly increased. To a casual observer, the company was thriving. But Grandpa Marcus had taught me to never look at the surface. You look at the current ratio. You look at the cash flow statements and the debt obligations. I started cross-referencing the public debt issuances with the state commercial property records. That is when I saw the first glaring red flag. It was subtle, buried deep in the footnotes of a publicly audited financial summary, but to a trained eye it was screaming like a fire alarm. 2 years ago, right around the time Grandpa Marcus had his first minor stroke, and Bradley officially stepped in as a quote-unquote temporary financial advisor to the board, the company's cash reserves began to plummet. The logistics business is heavily dependent on liquid cash. You need massive amounts of capital readily available to cover fluctuating fuel costs, unexpected vehicle maintenance, and weekly driver payrolls. Grandpa Marcus had always kept a pristine fortress-like cash cushion to weather any economic storm. But according to the latest public filings, the company had taken out 3 massive high-interest corporate loans in the past 18 months. Millions of dollars in new corporate debt had been secured against the physical warehouses. Yet the trucking fleet had not been upgraded. No new commercial properties had been purchased. No major expansions had been announced. The operating expenses had inexplicably doubled over the last 8 quarters, but the gross revenue had remained entirely flat. Money does not just evaporate into thin air. It moves. It leaves a paper trail. Someone was bleeding my grandfather's company dry from the inside out, masking the missing cash with predatory corporate loans to keep the daily operations afloat. And if the cash reserves were as critically low as these public filings suggested, the company was not just in minor financial trouble, it was on the verge of total catastrophic collapse. One missed loan payment, and the banks would seize the trucks. Suddenly, Bradley's explosive reaction at the dinner table made perfect sense. He was not trying to freeze the assets this morning to protect the family's legacy. He was trying to freeze them so I could not see the missing money. He needed the estate tied up in probate court so he could quietly cover his tracks and let the company go bankrupt under a mountain of artificial debt. I slammed my laptop shut and shoved it into my bag. I grabbed my car keys from the cheap motel nightstand. I did not have time to wait for Mr. Sterling or the probate lawyers to formalize my position. If I waited even 24 hours, Bradley and his team of corporate fixers would shred the internal documents and wipe the servers clean. I needed to get inside that corporate headquarters right now, establish my absolute authority, and seize the physical accounting drives before the white-collar criminals could burn the evidence. I pulled my practical sedan into the expansive parking lot of Marcus Logistics Incorporated. The building was a massive glass and steel structure that my grandfather had custom-built just 10 years ago to oversee his sprawling network of distribution warehouses. Usually the lobby was humming with the frantic energy of dispatchers and fleet managers. But when I pushed through the heavy revolving doors, the atmosphere was dead silent. A tense, suffocating anxiety hung in the air. The front desk receptionist looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. She pointed a shaking finger toward the main executive conference room down the hall. I did not need to ask what was going on. I could see them through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the boardroom. Bradley was standing at the head of the long, polished table. He was surrounded by 4 older white men in immaculately tailored custom suits. They were corporate litigators. I could spot their type from a mile away. They carried themselves with an aggressive, predatory entitlement, shuffling stacks of legal documents and barking orders at my grandfather's terrified administrative staff. I pushed the glass door open and stepped into the room. The moment I crossed the threshold, the murmuring stopped. Bradley turned to look at me, a smug, condescending smile spreading across his face. He slowly buttoned his expensive suit jacket, acting completely at home, in an office he had absolutely no right to be in. "Well, look who decided to show up," Bradley announced, his voice booming across the room so every employee in the vicinity could hear. "I was wondering when you would make an appearance, Nia. Did you take a wrong turn on your way to the temp agency?" I ignored his pathetic attempt at a joke and walked directly toward him, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "You are trespassing, Bradley," I said, my voice steady and loud enough to carry through the open door. "By the legal authority vested in me through Marcus Vance's final will and testament, I am the active chief executive officer of this company. I want you and your legal team off this property immediately, or I will have security escort you out for corporate espionage." The four corporate lawyers actually chuckled. One of them, a silver-haired man with a ridiculously expensive gold watch, looked down at his notepad as if I were a mild annoyance. Bradley simply sighed, shaking his head slowly, like a disappointed teacher dealing with a slow student. "Nia, sweetheart," Bradley said, taking a slow step toward me. "Let me explain how the real world works. I know you are used to sitting in a little cubicle balancing petty cash receipts, but corporate law is a bit more complicated than that. You see, when a will is heavily contested due to glaring evidence of elderly manipulation, the probate court does not just hand over a $50 million enterprise to an unqualified bookkeeper. My attorneys here have already filed an emergency ex parte injunction with the state court. We are freezing every single corporate bank account, every line of credit, and every physical asset attached to this company. You cannot touch a dime. You cannot fire anyone. You cannot even order a box of pens without my explicit legal authorization." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a patronizing whisper that made my skin crawl. "You tried to play a high-stakes game, but you do not even know the rules. Go back to your little motel room and wait for the summons. The adults are handling the business now." I did not flinch. I looked him dead in the eye. An ex parte injunction takes at least 48 hours to be reviewed by a judge. I replied, my tone completely flat and clinical. "Until a state judge physically signs that specific order and serves it to me directly, your paperwork is nothing but an expensive stack of trash. I am still the legal CEO. Now get out of my building before I call the local police." Bradley's smug smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. He knew I was legally right. His lawyers knew I was legally right. They were trying to use pure intimidation and aggressive posturing to force me out before I could actually take control of the servers. Before Bradley could formulate a response, the heavy wooden door of the accounting department swung open. Out walked Robert, the company's chief financial officer. Robert was a 55-year-old man who had spent the last decade kissing my mother's feet to keep his six-figure salary. He was Vivian's absolute most loyal pawn inside the company. He walked into the conference room carrying a sleek silver briefcase and clutching a small black encrypted external hard drive tightly to his chest. "Robert," I said sharply, turning my attention away from Bradley. "I need you to grant me immediate administrative access to the primary financial servers. I need the general ledger from the past 36 months, the debt schedules, and all unredacted vendor payment histories." Robert stopped in his tracks. He looked at Bradley, who gave him a subtle, encouraging nod. Then Robert turned to look at me, curling his lip in a blatant display of disgust. "I do not take orders from you." Robert sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Vivian called me this morning. She told me exactly what you did to your grandfather. You are a disgrace to this family and to this company. I refuse to work under an illegitimate CEO who stole this business out from under its rightful heirs." He adjusted his grip on the encrypted hard drive. "In fact, I am resigning effective immediately. I am not going to sit around and watch you drive Marcus Logistics into the ground because you do not know the difference between a balance sheet and a grocery receipt." "Put the drive down, Robert," I commanded, stepping between him and the exit. "That is corporate property. If you walk out of this building with internal financial data, you are committing corporate theft and violating federal trade secret laws. I will press charges." Robert let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "This drive contains my personal human resources files and my private tax documents," he lied smoothly, looking me right in the eye. "Unless you have a warrant, you cannot touch it. And since your authority is currently being contested by a team of elite litigators, I suggest you get out of my way before I file a harassment suit. He aggressively pushed past my shoulder. The security guards standing in the hallway simply watched, too confused and intimidated by Bradley's shouting lawyers to intervene. Robert walked straight out the front doors, taking the master ledger and the only unencrypted copies of the suspicious consulting contracts right out of the building. Bradley clapped his hands together slowly, an obnoxiously loud sound in the quiet room. "Well," he said cheerfully, "it looks like your executive team is already jumping ship. It is truly a tragedy what you are doing to this place, Nia. We will see you in court." Bradley and his lawyers packed up their briefcases and marched out of the room, leaving behind a trail of terrified employees and absolute operational chaos. I stood alone in the center of the massive glass conference room. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from the massive surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. They thought taking the hard drive would blind me. They thought freezing the accounts would paralyze me. They had no idea who they were actually fighting. I walked down the hall and entered my grandfather's grand executive office. It smelled like his favorite cedarwood cologne and old leather. I sat down behind the massive mahogany desk, placing my hands flat against the cool polished wood to steady myself. I needed to think. I needed to build a completely new data map from scratch using only secondary fragmented sources. Before I could even open my laptop, the heavy black multi-line phone on the desk began to ring violently. The caller identification screen flashed a number I instantly recognized. It was the commercial lending division of the largest corporate bank in Atlanta. I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear. "This is Nia Vance," I answered, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Ms. Vance, this is David Harrison, the senior loan officer at First Republic Commercial. I am calling regarding the emergency notification we received from your brother-in-law's legal team this morning. We were informed of a hostile leadership dispute and a severe compromise in your accounting department's data integrity." I closed my eyes, realizing exactly what Bradley had done. He did not just file an injunction to freeze the accounts. He intentionally called the bank to trigger a panic. "Mr. Harrison, the situation is completely under control." I lied smoothly. "We are undergoing a standard internal audit following my grandfather's passing." "I am afraid that is not sufficient." The banker interrupted, his tone completely ruthless and devoid of any sympathy. "Your grandfather's company holds a $20 million revolving credit facility with our institution. Your current corporate debt structure requires strict monthly covenant reporting. With your accounts officially frozen by a pending court order, and your chief financial officer resigning abruptly, you are now legally in breach of your loan covenants." A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. "What exactly does that mean for our operational cash flow today?" I asked. "It means we are invoking our right to accelerate the debt," David Harrison replied coldly. "You have until Friday at 5 in the afternoon to produce a fully audited, unredacted financial statement proving your liquid cash reserves, and you must have that court injunction completely lifted. If you cannot meet these demands by Friday, we will call in the entirety of the $20 million loan. We will seize the logistics fleet and padlock the warehouses by Monday morning. Have a good day, Ms. Vance." The line went completely dead. I slowly placed the receiver back onto the cradle. Friday. I had exactly 4 days to crack an encrypted network, trace millions of dollars in stolen cash, and defeat a team of elite corporate lawyers, or my grandfather's entire legacy would be auctioned off for scraps. Bradley had designed the perfect trap, but he made one critical, fatal mistake. He trapped a forensic accountant inside a room full of numbers. I walked over to the heavy oak double doors of the executive office and turned the brass deadbolt. The loud, solid click echoed in the silent room. I was entirely alone. I walked back to the massive mahogany desk, opened my laptop, and took a deep, steadying breath. Robert thought he was clever by taking the physical hard drive. Bradley thought he was invincible by freezing the bank accounts and cutting off my administrative access. But they fundamentally misunderstood how modern corporate networks actually operate. Data is exactly like water. It leaves a permanent stain no matter how quickly you try to mop it up. I ran my hand along the edge of my grandfather's desk, feeling the familiar worn grooves in the wood. Suddenly, I was 12 years old again. It was a late Tuesday night, long after the office staff had gone home. Grandpa Marcus had hoisted me up onto this exact desk, spreading a massive paper spreadsheet across my lap. The warehouse below us was vibrating with a rumble of diesel engines. He tapped a thick, blunt finger against a column of numbers. "Look closely, little one," he had said, his voice a low, rich rumble. "Most people read a balance sheet like read a book, going from left to right, accepting whatever story the author wants to tell them. Do not do that. Numbers do not lie, Nia, but the men who write them absolutely do. You do not look at what is on the page, you look at what is missing. You look at the shadows. If a warehouse claims to be operating at full capacity, but their monthly electricity bill suddenly drops by 30%, somebody is lying. Find the shadow, Nia. That is exactly where the rats hide. I shook the memory away and pulled a thick Ethernet cable from the wall, bypassing the wireless network entirely and plugging directly into the executive access port. I did not have the master passwords anymore. The IT department had already suspended my Active Directory credentials on Bradley's orders, but they had not severed the physical connection to the internal routing network. I started typing. I did not go after the main financial servers first. That would immediately trigger a security alarm and shut me out completely. Instead, I went after the mundane machines, the network printers, the high-capacity scanners sitting in the hallways, the fax machines in the billing department. Every single time Robert or anyone in the accounting department printed an invoice, a temporary image file was stored in the printer's internal memory cache. It was tedious, grueling work. I wrote a custom extraction script to pull thousands of fragmented data packets from the peripheral devices, funneling them directly into a secured, encrypted partition on my own hard drive. I used optical character recognition software to convert those messy digital images back into searchable numbers. The first 24 hours were a complete blur of raw data dumping. By Tuesday morning, the sun was streaming through the executive blinds, but I had not moved from the desk except to use the private executive bathroom. I ordered black coffee and stale sandwiches from a local deli, forcing the delivery guy to slide the food through a small gap in the door while I held the deadbolt firm. I completely ignored the relentless pounding from Bradley's lawyers out in the hallway. Every few hours, one of them would slide a threatening legal notice under the door demanding I vacate the premises. Let them shout. Let them threaten. I was entirely consumed by the digital puzzle in front of me. By Wednesday night, my eyes were burning. My back ached from sitting in the same rigid position, and I was running on exactly 4 hours of sleep, spread across 3 days. I had taken to sleeping on the leather sofa for 20 minutes at a time, setting an alarm on my phone so I would not lose momentum. The raw data I had extracted was a massive, chaotic mess of unformatted numbers, partial vendor names, and fragmented routing codes. It was a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing and no picture on the box. But I did not need the whole picture. I just needed to find the shadow. I started rebuilding the general ledger line by line. I cross-referenced the fragmented printer caches with the public filings I had downloaded back at the cheap motel. I built massive pivot tables and mapped out the operational expenses for the last 40 months. I applied Benford's law, a mathematical principle that forensic accountants use to detect financial fraud. In naturally occurring business data sets, the number 1 should appear as the leading digit about 30% of the time. But fabricated numbers invented by a human trying to hide something, distribute completely differently. Human beings are terrible at being random. I ran the algorithm across Robert's expense reports. Fuel costs matched the market rate. Driver payroll was completely accurate and naturally distributed. Fleet maintenance was slightly high but within a normal standard deviation. Robert was a meticulous accountant. He covered his tracks beautifully. On paper, every single dollar was accounted for, neatly categorized under legitimate-sounding operational expenses. But Grandpa Marcus's voice echoed loudly in my head. Find the shadow. I stopped looking at the massive expenses. I stopped looking at the trucks and the warehouses. I started looking at the administrative margins. And right there, buried deep within a highly complex spreadsheet, the algorithm flagged an anomaly. It was a tiny recurring statistical error hidden within the legal and professional services category. I highlighted the row, my heart starting to beat a little faster against my ribs. It was categorized under external logistics consulting. Now Marcus Logistics was an absolute industry leader. My grandfather knew more about freight routes than anyone on the eastern seaboard. We did not hire external consultants to tell us how to route our own trucks. My grandfather absolutely despised corporate consultants. Yet starting exactly 3 years ago, a series of monthly payments had been consistently authorized and pushed through the accounting software. I ran a deep forensic trace on the vendor name. Apex Global Solutions. It sounded incredibly legitimate. A perfect, boring corporate name designed to blend in on a busy bank statement. But when I pulled the payment routing data I had scraped from a scanned approval form, the destination was not a corporate bank in Atlanta or a consulting firm in New York. The routing number belonged to a private offshore trust located in the Cayman Islands. I started pulling every single invoice associated with Apex Global Solutions. I added up the monthly payments. $50,000 the first month, $75,000 the next. By the end of year 2, the payments had ballooned to over $150,000 a month every single month like clockwork. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, the harsh blue glow of the laptop screen illuminating the dark, quiet office. It was Thursday morning. I had been locked in this room for 72 hours. I looked at the final calculated total at the bottom of my screen. 3 years, $40 million in gross revenue generated by the actual blood and sweat of my grandfather's drivers. And exactly $4.2 million had been quietly bled out of the company, funneled directly into a ghost account that produced absolutely zero value for the business. This was the reason the company was failing to meet its loan covenants. This was the reason we were out of liquid cash. It was not a struggling market. It was a massive systematic embezzlement scheme. I had found the hidden ledger. Someone had been draining my family's legacy, drop by drop. Now I just needed to prove exactly who was holding the pen, and I had a very strong suspicion it was the same man who had threatened to destroy me at the dinner table. I finally stepped away from the glowing screen early Sunday morning. I had spent 4 days living inside a digital fortress of financial data, but I knew I could not hide in that office forever. I needed to face them. I went back to my cheap motel, took a burning cold shower to wash away the exhaustion, and put on my sharpest tailored navy blue suit. I was not going to the police station yet. I was going to church. First Corinthian Baptist was not just a place of worship. It was the absolute epicenter of affluent African American society in our city. It was the place where lucrative business deals were whispered in the vestibule, social statuses were solidified, and local reputations were either crowned or completely destroyed. My mother Vivian was the undisputed queen of that congregation. She sat on the board of trustees, organized the annual charity galas, and heavily funded the choir. I knew exactly where she would take her smear campaign next, and I knew she would use the pulpit as her personal stage. When I walked through the heavy wooden doors of the massive sanctuary, the choir was already singing. The room was packed with hundreds of people dressed in custom hats and expensive designer suits. I did not walk down the main aisle. I slipped quietly into a pew near the back. I could clearly see my family sitting in the front row, the prime seating reserved for the highest donors and the most respected elders. Vivian wore a severe black lace dress, playing the part of the devastatingly beautiful grieving widow of the estate, even though it was her father who had passed. Chloe sat next to her, elegantly dabbing her dry eyes with a silk tissue. Bradley was there too, sitting tall and playing the role of the steadfast, supportive husband. They looked like a perfect painting of grief and unity. About halfway through the service, Pastor Jenkins stepped up to the clear acrylic podium. He was a highly charismatic man who loved the sound of his own preaching and loved the deep pockets of my mother even more. "Today we are bearing the heavy burden of a family in deep pain," Pastor Jenkins boomed through the massive state-of-the-art sound system. "Sister Vivian and her daughter Chloe have suffered a tremendous loss this week with the passing of Marcus. But the devil does not just attack our health. He attacks our homes. He attacks our children. Sister Vivian, please come forward and share your testimony with the church family." My mother stood up slowly, physically supported by Chloe, as if she were too weak to walk alone. They walked up the carpeted altar steps, to a chorus of sympathetic murmurs from the congregation. Vivian took the microphone, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed sorrow. "Church family, I stand before you with a completely broken heart," Vivian said, letting a single calculated tear fall down her cheek. "My father was a great man. He built a legacy for this entire community. But in his final days, when his mind was clouded and weak, that legacy was hijacked. My youngest daughter, Nia, turned her back on God and her family. She manipulated a dying man into signing away his life's work. She locked us out of our own inheritance out of pure spite and greed. We are completely devastated." The congregation gasped softly. Hundreds of heads turned, scanning the room, until they inevitably spotted me sitting alone in the back row. The collective glare of the entire church felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Hushed whispers broke out among the wooden pews. They were looking at me with absolute disgust. Chloe leaned into the microphone next. "We just want our sister back," Chloe whimpered, looking directly at the ceiling as if asking for divine intervention. "We want her to stop letting money poison her soul and do the right thing for our grandfather's memory." Pastor Jenkins took the microphone back, his eyes locking directly onto mine across the massive room. He pointed a stern, righteous finger toward the back of the sanctuary. "Sister Nia, the Lord requires reconciliation." He preached, his voice echoing off the stained glass windows. "You cannot hide from the truth in the house of God. Come down to this altar right now. Repent for what you have done to your grieving mother. Give back the blessing you stole so this prominent family can begin to heal." The congregation actually started clapping in agreement. It was a slow, rhythmic pressure demanding my total submission. My mother smiled faintly from the stage, genuinely thinking she had trapped me. She thought the immense social pressure of our tight-knit community would crush me into handing over the corporate shares just to escape the public humiliation. She expected me to run out the back doors in tears. Instead, I stood up. I smoothed the jacket of my suit, picked up my leather purse, and walked confidently down the center aisle. I did not lower my head. I looked directly at the altar. The clapping slowly died down into a tense, deafening silence. Every single eye in the building watched my every step. I could hear the sharp click of my heels against the polished hardwood floors. I reached the front of the church and stopped at the base of the altar steps. Sitting on a velvet table right in front of Pastor Jenkins was the massive golden offering plate waiting for the special building fund collection. I opened my purse and pulled out a crisp cashier's check. It was a check I had drawn from the profits of my own independent forensic accounting firm, not a single dime from my grandfather's company. It was made out to the church for exactly $50,000. I held it up just long enough for Pastor Jenkins to clearly see the number printed on the paper. His eyes widened in absolute shock. I dropped the check into the empty gold plate. Then I took one step up and leaned directly toward the microphone still resting in the pastor's hand. I did not shout. I spoke softly, but the audio system broadcast my calm, steady voice into every corner of the silent sanctuary. "I did not steal anything, Pastor," I said clearly. "I am a forensic accountant. I just donated $50,000 of my own hard-earned money to cover the tithes my mother has been paying using stolen corporate funds. You should pray for her soul, and you should pray for her son-in-law because the federal audit starts tomorrow morning." The reaction was instantaneous. A collective shockwave of gasps rippled through the pews. Someone in the second row actually dropped their Bible. Pastor Jenkins practically dropped the microphone. My mother's face drained of all color, her jaw dropping open in sheer unadulterated horror. Chloe grabbed Bradley's arm, her fake tears instantly vanishing, replaced by genuine panicked confusion. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on the altar and walked straight back up the center aisle. The congregation parted slightly, staring at me not with disgust anymore, but with a terrifying awe. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and walked out into the bright Sunday sunlight. The crisp air felt amazing in my lungs. I walked toward my car, pulling my keys from my purse. But before I could unlock the door, a heavy hand slammed onto the roof of my sedan. I turned around. Bradley was standing there. He had sprinted out of the church right behind me. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed with absolute blinding rage. The calm, wealthy white savior persona was completely gone. He looked like a cornered, desperate animal. "You think you are so smart?" Bradley hissed, stepping dangerously close to me and invading my personal space. "You think you can just walk in there and drop a bomb like that and walk away? You have absolutely no proof of any stolen funds, Nia." I looked him up and down with complete, icy indifference. "I have the digital cash from your offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands, Bradley," I replied coldly. "Apex Global Solutions, $4.2 million siphoned under fraudulent consulting fees over the last 3 years. Did you really think deleting the master ledger would stop me? I rebuild financial histories from digital dust for a living. I know exactly what you did." Bradley's eyes twitched. For a brief second, true fear flashed across his face, but his staggering arrogance quickly swallowed it. He sneered, leaning down to my eye level. "No one is going to believe a single word you say, Nia. Do you know why? Because you are sick. You locked yourself in a corporate office for 4 days. You refused to speak to your grieving family. You are acting completely erratic and delusional." He pulled his phone from his suit pocket and tapped the screen aggressively. I have a specialized medical team on standby, he threatened, his voice dropping to a malicious whisper. My lawyers are filing an emergency medical injunction tomorrow morning. We are going to declare you legally insane. We are going to place you under an involuntary psychiatric hold, and Vivian will be granted full legal guardianship over all your decisions, including your shares in the logistics company. You are not going to a federal auditor, Nia. You are going to a padded cell, and I will own everything. I did not flinch at his threat. I simply hit the unlock button on my key fob, opened the car door, and slid into the driver's seat. Bradley slammed his heavy hand against the glass window as I rolled it up, his face twisted in an ugly mask of pure rage, but I just put the car in drive and pulled out of the church parking lot. Let him try to file a medical injunction. I knew that the courts required extensive independent psychiatric proof of mental incapacity, and his fabricated narrative would not hold up against hard financial evidence. But I also knew I was racing against a relentless ticking clock. Bradley was getting desperate, and desperate men with deep pockets are incredibly dangerous. By Monday morning, the true scale of his desperation became completely public. I had driven straight back to the corporate office and barricaded myself in the executive suite again, determined to link Bradley directly to the offshore accounts before the bank deadline on Friday. At exactly 8 in the morning, my phone started buzzing with frantic text messages from the few remaining loyal employees out on the dispatch floor. I opened the web browser on my laptop and navigated to the homepage of the local business journal. There it was, plastered right across the top of the digital front page in bold black letters. Heiress hijacks logistics empire to fund secret lover in multi-million-dollar embezzlement scandal. I clicked on the article, my blood running completely cold, as I read the expertly crafted lies. Anonymous sources, clearly Bradley and my sister Chloe, painted a deeply disturbing picture of me as an erratic, unstable woman. The article explicitly claimed that my grandfather had been aggressively coerced into changing his will while under heavy pain medication. It stated that immediately upon taking control of the company, I had locked myself in the executive office to wire millions of dollars in corporate cash to a secret romantic partner. They even twisted my 4-day forensic data audit, claiming I was experiencing a severe manic episode, destroying company property, and refusing to communicate with the board of directors. Chloe had clearly used her extensive social media following and her high society connections to amplify the smear campaign. She was sharing the article across all her platforms, attaching crying selfies and begging the public to pray for her family while they tried to save her grandfather's legacy from her unhinged sister. It was a perfectly executed public relations hit piece, designed to completely destroy my credibility before the medical injunction was even filed in court. The fallout was immediate and utterly devastating. The commercial logistics industry is built entirely on trust, reputation, and absolute reliability. Grandpa Marcus had spent 40 years shaking hands, looking men in the eye, and delivering on his promises. Within 2 hours of the article going live, the massive multi-line phone system on my desk lit up like a Christmas tree. Long-term clients, the loyal vendors who had kept this company afloat through economic recessions, were pulling their contracts in a complete panic. The chief executive officer of a major regional grocery chain called me directly. He sounded deeply apologetic but incredibly firm. He said he respected my grandfather immensely, but his corporate board of directors would not allow their vital supply chain to be associated with a scandalous hostile takeover and missing millions. He canceled our freight contract effective immediately. A massive steel manufacturer from Ohio followed suit 20 minutes later, citing a breach of faith. By lunchtime, we had lost over $3 million in projected monthly revenue. The panic quickly spread from the clients to our own workforce. I could hear the anxious murmurs through the heavy oak doors of the executive suite. The warehouse managers were terrified that the bank accounts were frozen. The drivers were threatening to park their trucks in the lots if they did not get an ironclad guarantee that Friday's payroll would clear. The empire my grandfather had built with his bare hands was actively crumbling into dust under the weight of Bradley's vicious rumors. Bradley wanted me to panic. He wanted me to burst out of that office call, a frantic press conference scream about my innocence, and look exactly like the unhinged, hysterical woman he claimed I was in the press. He wanted me to lose my composure so his lawyers could hand that footage directly to a judge. But I am a forensic accountant. I do not deal in public relations, and I do not deal in emotions. I deal in absolute, undeniable data. I muted the ringing phones on the desk, closed the heavy blinds to the executive office, and turned my attention back to the glowing screen of my laptop. Let the clients cancel their contracts today. Let the rumors fly across the country club. The only thing that mattered now was proving exactly who owned Apex Global Solutions. I already knew the stolen corporate money was flowing into a shell company bank account in the Cayman Islands. but offshore banking is notoriously opaque and fiercely protected. The account was registered under a blind proxy trust, hiding the true ultimate beneficiary behind thick layers of international banking secrecy laws. I could not subpoena the Cayman Bank for the account holder's name without a federal judge, and I did not have time to navigate the federal court system. Friday was approaching fast, so I stopped looking at the money itself, and I started looking at the digital footprints surrounding the money. Whoever was operating that offshore account had to log into the banking portal to move the funds around. Even with advanced encryption and virtual private networks, every digital action leaves a trace if you know exactly how to dissect the routing packets. I wrote a highly specialized tracking script designed to monitor network traffic anomalies. I began cross-referencing the exact dates and times of the fraudulent consultant payouts with the wireless server logs I had scraped from the company network. It took hours of agonizing digital excavation. I sifted through thousands of lines of meaningless binary code searching for a single tiny mistake. And then, right around 3 in the afternoon, I found a matching timestamp. On the exact day last month that a $150,000 payment was wired to the Cayman account, someone had used the guest wireless network in our own corporate boardroom to access a highly secured overseas server. I isolated the connection request and traced the returning authentication handshake. The IP address did not bounce to a corporate wealth management firm or a quiet Swiss bank building. It routed directly to a local internet service provider situated in the Caribbean. I pulled up the geographic registry for that specific IP, blocked my eyes scanning the coordinates as my software locked onto the signal origin. The digital trail ended at a physical address. It was not an anonymous concrete office building in the financial district of Georgetown. It was a residential property. I quickly opened a satellite mapping application and typed the exact coordinates into the search bar. The screen zoomed in rapidly on a lush tropical coastline, settling on a sprawling luxury property nestled inside a highly exclusive gated community. I zoomed in closer, examining the high-resolution satellite image. It was a massive, beautiful beachfront mansion with a private boat dock, a pristine infinity swimming pool, and 2 luxury vehicles parked in the circular driveway. Bradley was not just hiding stolen money in an offshore vault to collect interest. He was funding a physical, tangible life overseas. I sat back in my chair, staring at the mansion on my screen. I just needed to figure out exactly who was living inside that house, and I had a feeling the answer was going to completely destroy my sister's perfect world. The Cayman Islands Property Registry is notoriously secretive. It is designed specifically to protect the identities of wealthy foreign investors hiding their assets from international tax authorities. But real estate transactions require utilities, and utility companies do not care about international banking secrecy. They only care about who is paying the monthly electric bill. I bypassed the heavily encrypted corporate registries and hacked directly into the public-facing portal of the local Island Water and Power Authority. I cross-referenced the physical address of the beachfront mansion with the payment routing numbers I had extracted from the Apex Global Solutions ledger. The account was not registered to a faceless corporation. It was registered to a woman named Rebecca Hayes. I immediately opened a new secure browser window and began running her name through global data brokers and social media archives. People who live completely funded luxury lifestyles rarely keep it entirely offline. They want to show off. It took me less than 20 minutes to find her digital footprint. Rebecca maintained a highly curated public lifestyle blog dedicated to her life as an expatriate living in a tropical paradise. I clicked on her most recent photo gallery titled Family Island Adventures. The high-resolution images loaded across my screen, and all the air completely left my lungs. There was Bradley. He was not wearing his expensive tailored corporate suits. He was dressed in casual linen beachwear, smiling brilliantly at the camera, with his arm wrapped tightly around Rebecca, a petite blonde white woman. Standing in front of them were 3 beautiful blonde children. I quickly scanned the captions below the photographs. Celebrating our 10th wedding anniversary and Tommy's 8th birthday. My sister Chloe had been married to Bradley for exactly 4 years. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the timestamp metadata embedded within the image files to ensure they were not old photographs. They were taken just 3 weeks ago. It was the exact same week Bradley told our family he had to fly to London for an emergency hedge fund conference. He was not in London. He was in the Caribbean, celebrating his real anniversary with his real wife. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped together, forming a picture so vile it made my stomach physically turn. This was not a sudden affair. This was not a wealthy man making a reckless mistake with a secret mistress. This was his actual established life. He had been married to Rebecca for 10 years. He had 3 children with her. He had a whole separate existence long before he ever met my sister at that charity gala in Atlanta. Chloe was the side piece. My arrogant status-obsessed sister, the golden child of our affluent African-American family, was nothing but a convenient, legally bound ATM. Bradley had targeted her specifically because she was desperate for the validation of a wealthy white finance executive. He had weaponized our family's deep-seated desire for proximity to white corporate power. My mother had practically worshipped Bradley, treating him better than her own flesh and blood because he represented elite Wall Street status and elevated her standing at the country club. But in reality, Bradley was a massive financial parasite. He was systematically siphoning the generational wealth my black grandfather had built with calloused hands, sleepless nights, and decades of grueling physical labor. Bradley was funneling every single stolen dime to fully fund his secret entirely white family living in tropical luxury. The country club memberships, the private island schooling, the beachfront mansion. It was all being paid for by the sweat of a black truck driver from Atlanta. It was not just corporate fraud. It was a deeply personal, racially charged betrayal. Bradley thought we were stupid. He thought our family was just a natural resource to be tapped, drained, and eventually discarded when the wells ran dry. I did not feel shock anymore. I did not feel sad for my sister. I felt a cold, calculated, absolute fury. I spent the next 2 hours systematically downloading every single photograph, blog post, and video from Rebecca's website. I pulled the raw data from the images to definitively prove the locations and timestamps. I matched the dates of Bradley's supposed overseas business trips with the dates of his children's island birthday parties and school events. I pulled the birth certificates from the international registry proving his paternity. I compiled everything into a massive, heavily encrypted digital dossier. I had the smoking gun, the bullets, and his fingerprints all over the weapon. Just as I finished locking down the final folder of evidence, the heavy black phone on the executive desk began to ring. The caller identification screen flashed my mother's cell phone number. I leaned back in my grandfather's leather chair, staring at the flashing red light. I let it ring 4 times before I finally picked up the receiver. Nia, my mother. Vivian's voice came through the speaker, thick with heavy theatrical tears. Please, I cannot take this anymore. I remained completely silent, letting her play her part. The country club is threatening to revoke my membership. Vivian sobbed, her voice trembling perfectly. My friends will not even return my calls after that awful magazine article came out. Your Aunt Denise is telling everyone in the neighborhood that we are bankrupt. You are destroying us, Nia. You are completely destroying this family's flawless reputation. I listened to her cry, recognizing it as a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She was blaming me for the public relations nightmare that Bradley and Chloe had intentionally orchestrated. Mom. I started softly, but she immediately cut me off. No, just listen to me, Nia, she pleaded. I know you are hurt. I know you always felt left out of the family business and jealous of your sister. But this crazy public stunt of yours has gone way too far. The company is losing clients by the hour. The bank is threatening to seize the trucks. But Bradley has a plan to fix it. He has private investors lined up to inject emergency capital into the company and save the logistics fleet from the bank deadline on Friday. But he cannot do it while you are holding the company hostage. I am begging you, let us declare a truce. A truce, I repeated, keeping my tone perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. Yes, Vivian cried, sounding desperate and exhausted. Just sign your shares over to Bradley. Relinquish your executive control to him completely. In exchange, we will instruct the lawyers to drop the medical injunction. We will not have you committed. We will even publicly state that you stepped down gracefully due to the overwhelming stress of your grandfather's passing. You can go back to your quiet little accounting job, and Bradley can save the family from complete public ruin. Please, Nia, be the bigger person. Do the right thing for once in your life, and save your family. I looked at the high-resolution photograph of Bradley kissing his secret wife on my laptop screen. I looked at the faces of his 3 blonde children, completely funded by my grandfather's stolen legacy. My mother was offering me a truce while aggressively holding a knife to my throat. She was willing to throw me into a psychiatric ward just to protect the white son-in-law who was actively robbing her blind. I smiled into the phone. The trap was set, and they were practically begging to step directly into it. Okay, Vivian. I said softly, injecting just the right amount of defeated exhaustion into my voice. You win. I cannot fight all of you anymore. I will sign the company over to Bradley. I heard a long, dramatic exhale through the phone speaker. My mother actually sighed with deep relief, though she immediately tried to mask it with her usual tone of authoritative disappointment. I knew you would finally come to your senses, Vivian said, her voice instantly regaining its crisp arrogance. It is a terrible shame that it took a massive public scandal and the near destruction of your grandfather's legacy for you to realize your own limitations. But I am a Christian woman and I am willing to forgive you. Family is family after all. I will call Bradley right now and tell his lawyers to pause the medical injunction. We can have the transfer documents drawn up by his legal team this afternoon, and you can sign them quietly in his office tomorrow morning. No, I interrupted, keeping my voice deliberately small and hesitant, perfectly mimicking the sound of a completely broken woman. Not at a law office. My mother paused, her tone sharpening with immediate suspicion. What are you playing at, Nia? I am not negotiating with you. I am not playing anything, I replied softly, letting a fake tremor slip into my voice. I am just thinking about the public relations nightmare. If we just quietly sign papers behind closed doors and I suddenly step down, the rumors are never going to stop. The Business Journal article is already out there. The clients are already pulling their contracts. If I just disappear into the shadows, people will think the embezzlement accusations were completely true, or worse, they will think you illegally forced me out of the company. It will look like a hostile cover-up. There was a heavy silence on the line. I knew I had just hit the exact nerve that controlled my mother's entire existence. Public perception. Vivian could tolerate a lot of things, but she could not tolerate looking bad in front of her high society peers. What exactly are you suggesting then? Vivian asked, her voice losing its aggressive edge and replacing it with cautious curiosity. Your annual black tie charity gala is this Saturday night, I said, looking directly at the folder of offshore bank records glowing on my laptop screen. The entire country club will be there. The church elders, the local press, the corporate board of directors, and our biggest logistics clients. If you truly want to restore the family's honor and save the company's public image before the bank seizes the assets, we need to do this in the open. We need to frame it as a peaceful, unified family decision. I took a slow breath, feeding her the exact fantasy I knew she desperately wanted. We can do a formal public transfer of leadership right there on the main stage. I will stand in front of everyone whose respect you care about, and I will publicly sign the controlling shares over to Bradley. I will give a speech saying I was simply overwhelmed by grief, that the shoes were too big to fill, and that Bradley is the only executive qualified to steer Grandpa Marcus's ship into the future. It will clear my name of the embezzlement rumors, and it will give you and Chloe the ultimate public victory. You will look like the graceful matriarch who kept her family together through a tragic crisis. I waited. The silence stretched for 5 seconds, 10 seconds. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head. My mother was deeply obsessed with the optics of black excellence. She did not just want to defeat me. She wanted to defeat me in front of an audience. She wanted the absolute validation of her peers. The idea of me willingly bowing my head and handing the crown to her chosen golden child on a brightly lit stage was a temptation she simply could not resist. That is actually a very mature and sensible idea, Nia, Vivian finally said, her voice dripping with extreme condescension and barely contained excitement. It is the least you can do after the massive embarrassment you have caused this family all week. I will have the event coordinator add a special legacy presentation to the gala itinerary right before the main charity auction. Bradley will bring the physical transfer contracts. Do not try to back out or the medical injunction gets filed on Monday morning. I will be there, I promised quietly. My mother hung up the phone without another word. I slowly lowered the receiver, the fake exhaustion instantly melting off my face, replaced by a cold mechanical focus. I could have easily taken the photographs of Bradley's secret white family and posted them across every social media platform right then. I could have sent the offshore banking records to the local business journal and cleared my name in 24 hours. But as a forensic accountant, I knew exactly how guilty men with money operated. If I exposed him online, Bradley would immediately hire an expensive crisis management team. He would claim the documents were digitally altered. He would use his hedge fund lawyers to tie the defamation case up in civil court for years. And most importantly, the moment he realized I knew about the Cayman Island accounts, he would electronically transfer that stolen $4.2 million into untraceable cryptocurrency and flee the country to be with his real wife. Chloe would be left completely bankrupt, and the logistics company would still collapse under the bank's debt call. I did not just want to embarrass them. I needed them permanently dismantled. I needed Bradley physically trapped in a room surrounded by witnesses completely confident in his victory and legally exposed on a federal level. I spent the rest of Thursday afternoon compiling the ultimate physical dossier. I printed out the high-resolution photographs of his secret island family. I printed the matching birth certificates. I printed the highly encrypted server logs, proving the exact IP addresses used to authorize the fraudulent consulting payments. I organized the general ledger, highlighting every single fake transaction that drained my grandfather's life work. I placed everything into a thick, heavy black binder. Then I picked up my cell phone and dialed a number I had acquired during a previous corporate fraud investigation. I did not call the local Atlanta Police Department. Local police do not understand complex offshore wire fraud, and they certainly do not move fast enough to freeze international assets. I needed the apex predators of the financial world. The line rang twice before a stern voice answered. Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division, Special Agent Thomas, speaking. Agent Thomas, I said, keeping my voice brisk and strictly professional. My name is Nia Vance. I am a licensed forensic accountant and the current legal chief executive officer of Marcus Logistics. I have a massive corporate embezzlement case for you. It involves $4.2 million in stolen corporate assets, international wire fraud, and a shell company in the Cayman Islands. I have the complete data trail, the routing numbers, and the identity of the perpetrator. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of a keyboard clacking. I am listening, Ms. Vance, the federal agent said, his tone shifting immediately to high alert. I am bringing the physical evidence to your field office in exactly 30 minutes, I continued. But I need you to know this is highly time-sensitive. The suspect is actively attempting to coerce me into signing over all legal rights to the company and the remaining assets this Saturday night at a public event. If he gets my signature, he will liquidate the domestic accounts and flee federal jurisdiction. Bring the files in immediately, Agent Thomas instructed. If your data is as ironclad as you claim, we can authorize an emergency federal wiretap and prepare a warrant. Where is this public event taking place? I smiled, looking at the invitation my mother had proudly emailed to the entire family mailing list weeks ago. The Oak Ridge Country Club, I replied. Black tie attire. I will make sure he gives you a full verbal confession right before you walk through the doors. I hung up the phone, grabbed the heavy black binder, and walked out of the executive office. The illusion of my defeat was perfectly set. My mother and sister were currently out shopping for new designer gowns, celebrating their impending wealth, completely oblivious to the fact that they were dressing up for their own funeral. They thought they had successfully bullied the quiet little bookkeeper into submission. They had absolutely no idea they had just invited the federal government to their perfect high society party. Friday morning arrived with the bright, naive sunshine of a perfect victory for my family. The illusion I had carefully planted the night before had bloomed into an absolute feast of staggering arrogance. Because they believed I was a broken, defeated woman who had surrendered out of pure fear, they completely stopped looking over their shoulders. They let their guard down, and they began to celebrate with the reckless entitlement of people who had never actually earned a single dollar they spent. Chloe kicked off the morning by marching into the exclusive Hermes boutique in the high-end Buckhead shopping district. She did not just want to buy a handbag, she wanted to make a statement. She demanded the private VIP viewing room and ordered the sales associates to keep the complimentary champagne flowing. In less than 2 hours, she dropped over $100,000 on exotic leather goods, silk scarves, and 2 highly coveted Birkin bags. She casually handed the cashier a premium credit card linked directly to a newly opened corporate expense account Bradley had authorized that very morning. I heard the entire story later from a former college friend who worked at the boutique. She said Chloe loudly bragged to everyone in the store that her brilliant husband had just single-handedly saved her grandfather's massive logistics empire from her crazy, unstable younger sister. Chloe walked out of the store completely convinced that her status as a wealthy elite socialite was permanently secured. While Chloe was busy spending stolen money to impress retail workers, Bradley was busy securing his real future. I had managed to keep a digital backdoor open on the corporate servers, just long enough to monitor his private network activity. I watched the encrypted data packets flow from his office computer to his private cell phone. He spent the entire morning pacing in his glass-walled hedge fund office, overlooking the Atlanta skyline, making long, unrecorded calls to the Cayman Islands. He was talking to Rebecca. He was telling his secret white wife that the final hurdle had been cleared. He promised her that by next week, the massive infusion of cash from liquidating my grandfather's warehouses would be completely untraceable. He told her to start looking at luxury yacht brochures and to contact a private broker about expanding their beachfront property. He was incredibly smug, completely oblivious to the fact that I had mapped every single coordinate of his tropical paradise. But nobody celebrated quite like my mother. Vivian held court at the Oak Ridge Country Club dining room for a late brunch. She sat at the center of a large round table surrounded by the exact same wealthy women she had been terrified of losing just 24 hours prior. She wore a pristine white designer suit, sipping a mimosa, and spinning a beautiful tragic tale of maternal sacrifice. She told her wealthy friends that I had suffered a severe mental breakdown from the grief of losing Grandpa Marcus. She claimed I was wildly overwhelmed by the corporate responsibilities, but that she had graciously stepped in to guide me back to the light. I had to put my foot down and put Nia back in her place. My mother boasted delicately, dabbing her mouth with a cloth napkin. It breaks a mother's heart to see her child struggle, but Bradley is officially taking over the company to protect our family's legacy. We are doing it publicly tomorrow night at the gala. Her friends nodded in deep sympathy, praising her strength and her unwavering commitment to Black excellence. They validated her ego exactly the way she craved. Vivian drove home that afternoon feeling like an absolute conquering queen. They were all so busy spending boasting and plotting their luxury vacations that they did not bother to wonder where I actually was. I was not hiding in my cheap motel room crying. I was not drafting a pathetic concession speech for the gala. I was sitting in a freezing cold, aggressively sterile interrogation room at the downtown Atlanta field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The room was a stark contrast to the luxurious environments my family was currently enjoying. There were no crystal chandeliers or imported leather sofas. There was just a heavy steel table, 2 uncomfortable metal chairs, and the harsh hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Sitting across from me were Special Agent Thomas and a senior forensic financial analyst named Agent Miller. I slid the massive black binder across the steel table. Agent Miller opened the binder. For the next 2 hours, the only sounds in the room were the rustling of heavy paper and the occasional sharp intake of breath from the federal agents. I watched their faces transform from cautious skepticism to absolute undeniable shock. They examined the optical character recognition data I had scraped from the printers. They reviewed the general ledger anomalies. They traced the offshore IP addresses line by line, comparing them to the corporate wireless logs. Finally, Agent Miller reached the back of the binder. She pulled out the high-resolution photographs of Bradley with Rebecca and their 3 blonde children, along with the certified international birth certificates proving his paternity. Agent Miller slowly closed the binder and looked at Agent Thomas. She handed us a fully wrapped federal indictment with a bow on top. She said, her voice laced with genuine professional awe. Most of our own senior accountants do not build data maps this clean. The cash flow tracing is completely airtight. This guy has been aggressively bleeding a multi-million-dollar domestic enterprise to fund an offshore shadow life. Agent Thomas leaned forward, folding his hands on the metal table and looking directly into my eyes. Ms. Vance, this is incredibly impressive work. What your brother-in-law is doing constitutes massive federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering. Based on this binder alone, I can have a federal judge sign a warrant to freeze his domestic bank accounts and pull his passport by 5 o'clock today. We can arrest him before he even puts his tuxedo on for your mother's gala tomorrow night. I shook my head firmly. Freezing his domestic accounts is not enough. I said, my voice cold and entirely steady. The domestic accounts are almost completely empty. The real money, the $4.2 million he stole from my grandfather's drivers, is sitting in the Apex Global Solutions account in the Cayman Islands. If you arrest him right now, he will immediately invoke his right to counsel. His expensive hedge fund lawyers will tie you up in jurisdictional red tape for months. Agent Thomas sighed, rubbing his jaw. You are right about the Caymans. Offshore banking jurisdictions are a massive legal nightmare. Even with your IP logs, his defense team will claim circumstantial evidence. They will say the Apex account actually belongs to your sister Chloe, or they will claim you fabricated the digital logs using your administrative access to frame him. Bradley will claim he was simply acting as a financial advisor following Vivian's instructions. Unless we catch him actively attempting to move the stolen offshore funds, proving absolute unilateral intent and control in a court of law is going to be a brutal uphill battle. Then what exactly do we need to make it a guaranteed conviction, I asked, leaning forward, so the federal agents understood I was not backing down. I did not do all of this work just to watch him walk away with a plea deal and a slap on the wrist. Agent Miller tapped the black binder. We need him to verbally claim ownership of the crime. We need an explicit, uncoerced admission of his direct control over the specific stolen funds or the offshore shell company. If we have him on tape proudly acknowledging his unilateral power over the Apex account before he signs those transfer papers or attempts to flee, his entire defense strategy crumbles. But guys like Bradley do not confess. They hide behind their corporate lawyers and their white privilege. I looked back and forth between the two federal agents. A slow, cold smile began to form on my face. Guys like Bradley do not confess to police officers, I agreed softly. But they absolutely love to brag to people they think are beneath them. He thinks I am a defeated little bookkeeper. He thinks he has completely broken my spirit. He wants to publicly humiliate me tomorrow night on that stage, and his ego is so massively inflated right now that he will not be able to resist taking a victory lap. Agent Thomas raised an eyebrow. You are suggesting a wiretap. I am suggesting you come to the Oak Ridge Country Club tomorrow night in black tie attire, I replied, standing up from the metal chair. Give me a concealed microphone. Let him get up on that stage and feel like a king. Give me 5 minutes with him in front of that crowd, and I promise you I will make him brag about every single stolen dollar directly into the federal record. Saturday arrived with a heavy, humid tension in the air. I woke up in my cheap motel room and began the meticulous process of preparing for war. This was not a physical battle, so I did not need armor. I needed optics. I needed to look the part of the defeated, exhausted daughter my mother expected, while secretly carrying the technological means to completely destroy them. I chose a simple, unadorned black evening gown. It was elegant but deliberately understated, lacking the flashy sequins or aggressive modern cuts my sister preferred. I pulled my hair back into a severe, tight bun. I applied my makeup with a light hand, intentionally leaving a faint shadow under my eyes, to emphasize the narrative that I had been losing sleep over the stress of my grandfather's company. I looked exactly like a woman who was ready to surrender. But the most important piece of my ensemble was not the dress. It was a heavy vintage silver pendant necklace that Grandpa Marcus had given me for my high school graduation. It was a beautiful piece, but it was also incredibly practical. Inside the hollow back of the silver pendant, Special Agent Miller had carefully secured a state-of-the-art military-grade audio transmitter. I stood in front of the cracked motel bathroom mirror and tapped the silver pendant lightly with my index finger. Testing 1, 2, 3, I whispered into the empty room. Loud and clear, Ms. Vance. Agent Thomas's voice crackled softly through a tiny flesh-colored earpiece tucked deep inside my left ear canal. We have agents stationed at all 3 main exits of the country club. The audio feed is being recorded directly to the federal server in real time. Remember, do not let him provoke you into a screaming match. You need to guide the conversation. Ask him specific questions about the Cayman accounts, the Apex Global Solutions ledger, and his control over the stolen funds. We need his ego to do the heavy lifting. Understood, I replied quietly, adjusting the heavy silver pendant against my collarbone. I am heading to the venue now. I arrived at the Oak Ridge Country Club just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the perfectly manicured golf greens. The driveway was packed with luxury vehicles and valets rushing to open doors for the city's elite. I handed my keys to a young valet and walked up the grand marble steps. The moment I stepped through the massive oak doors into the main ballroom, the atmosphere shifted. The room was breathtaking, decorated with cascading white orchids, towering crystal centerpieces, and soft jazz playing from a live band in the corner. There were easily 500 people mingling with champagne flutes in hand. It was the absolute pinnacle of high society, and every single one of them was staring at me. The whispers started immediately rippling through the crowd like a sudden chill in the air. I could feel their eyes tracking my every movement. These were the people who had read the Business Journal article. These were the people my mother had actively poisoned against me at her brunch. They looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and outright disgust. I saw the CEO of the grocery chain who had canceled our freight contract turn his back completely as I walked past his table. I kept my head slightly bowed, playing my part perfectly. I walked toward the back of the ballroom, intending to stay out of sight until the legacy presentation began. But before I could reach the shadows, a sharp manicured hand grabbed my arm, its fingernails digging painfully into my skin. "Well, look who actually showed up," my sister Chloe hissed, yanking me behind a large floral arrangement near the catering entrance. Chloe looked absolutely radiant, wearing a custom emerald green gown that probably cost more than my first car. Her hair was perfectly styled in cascading waves, and her neck glittered with diamonds. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a cruel, triumphant sneer. "I was not sure if you would actually have the nerve to show your face tonight, Nia," she mocked, her voice dripping with venom. "But I suppose you had no choice. Mom said you finally realized you are completely incompetent. It is about time you admitted it." I looked at her standing there in her expensive gown, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire life was a lie, built on stolen money and a husband who was using her as a legal shield. A tiny part of me almost felt sorry for her, but then I remembered the way she had treated Grandpa Marcus like an ATM, and the pity vanished instantly. "I am just here to do what Mom asked," I said softly, keeping my eyes downcast. Chloe laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that clashed with the elegant jazz music. "You mean you are here to fix the massive mess you made? You almost destroyed Grandpa's legacy in a single week because you wanted to play CEO. You are so pathetic, Nia. You always have been." She reached into her expensive designer clutch and pulled out a small, battered blue object. She shoved it aggressively against my chest. I caught it before it hit the floor. It was a cheap plastic ballpoint pen. I recognized it immediately. It was the exact same pen Grandpa Marcus had used 30 years ago to sign the lease for his very first commercial delivery truck. He had kept it in a velvet box in his desk drawer as a reminder of his humble beginnings. It was his most prized possession. "Bradley and I thought it would be beautifully poetic," Chloe sneered, leaning in close so I could smell the heavy scent of her expensive perfume. "You tried to steal everything Grandpa built, so we want you to use his lucky pen to sign it all over to the actual man of the house. Consider it a final lesson in respect. Do not mess this up, Nia. When Mom calls you up to the stage, you smile, you sign the papers, and you hand the company over to my husband." She turned on her heel and strutted back into the ballroom, disappearing into a crowd of wealthy admirers. I stood alone behind the floral arrangement, gripping the cheap plastic pen so tightly my knuckles turned white. They were not just trying to defeat me. They were trying to completely strip away my dignity. They were using my grandfather's memory as a weapon to humiliate me in front of 500 people. But I was not going to break. I took a deep, steadying breath and touched the silver pendant on my chest. "I am ready," I whispered into the hidden microphone. "Let the show begin." The live jazz band faded into a soft, elegant instrumental hum as the waitstaff began clearing the expensive china from the tables. The warm amber lighting of the ballroom dimmed, directing the attention of all 500 guests toward the massive main stage at the front of the room. A hush fell over the crowd as the master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone, formally introducing the highlight of the evening. It was time for the legacy presentation. My mother, Vivian, gracefully ascended the stage stairs, looking absolutely regal in her pristine white gown. She approached the clear acrylic podium and looked out over the sea of wealthy, influential faces. She took a deep breath, perfectly simulating the heavy emotion of a grieving daughter, burdened with the weight of an empire. "My friends, my beautiful community," Vivian began, her voice echoing flawlessly through the state-of-the-art sound system. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate charity, but we are also here to honor legacy. As many of you know, our family recently lost its patriarch. My father, Marcus Vance, was a giant. He was a pioneer of black excellence who built a logistics empire from the ground up. He taught us that true wealth is not just about the money we accumulate, but about the strength of the family that protects it." She paused, bowing her head slightly. A murmur of sympathetic agreement rippled through the audience, but sometimes Vivian continued, lifting her chin with a look of manufactured maternal sorrow. "The weight of that legacy is simply too heavy for one person to carry alone. The transition of power is never easy, and grief can cloud our judgment. It can make us overwhelmed. It can make us lose our way. My youngest daughter, Nia, has struggled immensely this past week. The pressure of stepping into her grandfather's shoes was an unfair burden, and it almost tore our company apart. But we are a strong family. We do not let our own fall. We step up, we forgive, and we restructure for the future." The crowd erupted into polite, dignified applause. Chloe was sitting at the front table, dabbing her dry eyes with a napkin, playing the supportive sister to absolute perfection. Tonight, Vivian said, raising her hands to quiet the room, we are putting things right. We are demonstrating what true Black excellence looks like when a family unites in crisis. Nia has bravely decided to step down and transfer the controlling shares of Marcus Logistics to a man who has the executive experience, the corporate vision, and the steady hand required to guide this ship forward. Please welcome my brilliant son-in-law Bradley and my courageous daughter Nia to the stage. The applause swelled again, this time louder and more enthusiastic. They were clapping for the return to the status quo. They were clapping because the wealthy white savior was stepping in to rescue the poor, overwhelmed Black family from their own internal chaos. I took a slow breath and stepped out from the shadows near the catering entrance. I kept my posture deliberately subdued, my shoulders slightly slumped, playing the part of the defeated woman walking to her own execution. I felt the heavy silver pendant resting against my collarbone, a cold, comforting reminder that I was not walking up there alone. Agent Thomas and Agent Miller were listening to every single breath I took. I climbed the stage stairs on the left while Bradley ascended from the right. He looked incredibly sharp in his custom-tailored tuxedo. He walked with the swagger of a conquering king, flashing a brilliant, charismatic smile to the audience. He stopped at the center of the stage, right next to the acrylic podium where a thick stack of legal documents lay waiting. I walked over and stood beside him. Vivian stepped back, offering me a tight, victorious smile that did not reach her cold eyes. She had won. She was getting exactly what she wanted in front of the entire country club. Bradley turned to me. To the audience, it looked like a tender, supportive moment between family members. He reached out and placed a firm hand on my shoulder, leaning down so his mouth was hovering just inches from my ear. He thought his voice was completely masked by the applause and the soft jazz music playing in the background. He had absolutely no idea that the military-grade microphone hidden inside my silver pendant was picking up every single syllable. "Sign the paper," little girl Bradley whispered, his voice dripping with a vicious, degrading malice that made my skin crawl. "This little charade is over. You really thought a pathetic diversity hire like you could outsmart a Wall Street executive? Your grandfather was nothing but a glorified blue-collar mule who got lucky, and your family is too stupid to hold on to real money." I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I needed him to keep talking. I needed him to hang himself with his own words. "Is the $4 million you already stole not enough to satisfy you, Bradley?" I whispered back, keeping my voice incredibly soft and trembling, projecting the exact image of a terrified victim. "Why do you need the company too?" Bradley chuckled, a dark, arrogant sound. He tightened his grip on my shoulder, completely blinded by his own inflated ego. "$4 million was just the appetizer, sweetheart," he murmured directly into my chest, right where the silver pendant rested. "That money is perfectly secured in the Apex Global Solutions account in the Caymans. I own that trust, I control every single dime, and nobody is ever going to trace it back to me. Once you sign these shares over, I am going to liquidate your grandfather's entire fleet by Monday morning. I am going to gut this pathetic ghetto delivery service, for parts cash out the commercial real estate, and leave you and your superficial mother with absolutely nothing. Thanks for the massive payday. Now pick up the pen and sign." He pulled back, instantly replacing his malicious sneer with that flawless, charming smile. He gestured gracefully toward the legal documents on the podium, playing the perfect gentleman for the 500 pairs of eyes watching us. I heard a sharp intake of breath through the tiny earpiece hidden in my ear canal. "We got him," Agent Thomas said, his voice crackling with intense, controlled adrenaline. "We have the absolute verbal confession. The wiretap is locked. Bring it home, Ms. Vance." I looked down at the thick stack of transfer contracts. I reached into my small black clutch and pulled out the cheap, battered blue plastic pen Chloe had given me. I stared at the logo printed on the side of the pen. Marcus Deliveries. It was the original name of my grandfather's company before he expanded it into an empire. I slowly rolled the plastic pen between my fingers. The ballroom was completely silent now. 500 people were holding their breath, waiting for me to surrender. My mother was practically vibrating with anticipation. Chloe was leaning forward in her chair, a smug grin plastered across her face. Bradley tapped his finger impatiently against the acrylic podium. I looked at the contract. Then I looked up at Bradley, dropping the facade of the broken woman entirely. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back. The illusion of defeat evaporated from my face, replaced by a cold forensic calculation. Bradley's smile faltered for a fraction of a second as he registered the sudden shift in my posture. He saw the fire reignite in my eyes, and for the first time all week, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed his face. I did not sign the document. Instead, I placed the cheap blue pen down on top of the papers. I turned my head and looked directly over the crowd, staring at the massive dark projector screen hanging from the ceiling at the back of the stage. I locked eyes with the audiovisual technician, sitting in the raised control booth at the far end of the ballroom. It was not the country club's usual employee. It was a young man I had personally hired and briefed 3 hours before the gala began. I gave him a single sharp nod. The young technician in the booth did not hesitate. His hands flew across the soundboard and the visual mixing console. Instantly, the soft ambient lighting in the ballroom was completely killed, plunging the audience into a dramatic, heavy darkness for one breathless second. Then the massive high-definition projector hanging from the vaulted ceiling violently flickered to life. A brilliant beam of harsh white light cut through the dark, hitting the giant screen suspended directly behind the main stage. The crowd expected to see the elegant looping gold font of the Oak Ridge Charity Gala logo, perhaps followed by a touching video montage of my grandfather Marcus smiling in front of his very first delivery truck. That was what my mother had paid the event planners to create. But that is not what appeared on the screen. Instead, a massive, incredibly complex digital diagram filled the entire 20-foot display. It was the forensic money flow map I had spent 4 days building in the executive office. The background was stark black. Brilliant neon red lines connected a series of official bank logos, routing numbers, and highly specific transaction dates. At the very center of the map, glowing in aggressive yellow text, was the name Apex Global Solutions, followed by the undeniable coordinates of a private trust located in the Cayman Islands. Underneath that, a massive bold number was tallied in bright red: $4.2 million. A wave of utter confusion swept through the 500 elite guests. Murmurs broke out across the room. I could hear the clinking of silverware stop completely. My mother Vivian turned around to look at the screen. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows knit together in deep annoyance. She leaned toward the edge of the stage and furiously waved her manicured hand at the event coordinator standing in the wings, clearly thinking the audiovisual team had accidentally loaded a corporate financial presentation instead of her memorial video. "Fix it!" she hissed under her breath, her country club smile straining at the edges, but Bradley did not think it was a technical glitch. I watched his face as he turned around and looked up at the massive glowing screen. The transformation was absolute and immediate. The arrogant, charming swagger completely evaporated from his posture. The blood violently drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as his brain rapidly processed exactly what he was looking at. He recognized the offshore routing numbers. He recognized the exact dates of the wire transfers. He recognized his own personal digital fingerprint plastered across a 20-foot screen in front of the most powerful people in the state. I did not wait for him to recover from the shock. I stepped right up to the clear acrylic podium. I aggressively pushed the thick stack of transfer contracts and the cheap blue plastic pen out of my way. They clattered uselessly to the floor. I grabbed the edges of the podium and leaned directly into the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice echoing like a crack of thunder through the silent ballroom. My mother just spoke beautifully about the concept of legacy. She told you that my grandfather built a multi-million-dollar empire from the ground up through sheer determination and black excellence. She was absolutely right about him, but she was entirely wrong about what happened to his money. The crowd went dead silent. Nobody was whispering anymore. Every single eye was glued to me. I raised my hand and pointed a firm finger directly at the massive screen behind me. "You are not looking at a charity video." I continued my tone, completely devoid of emotion, operating with the cold, surgical precision of a forensic accountant. "You are looking at a masterclass in corporate embezzlement. For the last 3 years, Marcus Logistics has been aggressively bled dry from the inside out. Exactly $4.2 million in liquid cash was systematically siphoned out of our domestic operating accounts. It was masked under the guise of phantom external consulting fees paid to a shell company called Apex Global Solutions." I hit a small wireless clicker hidden in the palm of my hand. The screen transitioned to a new slide. It displayed a side-by-side comparison. On the left were the falsified vendor invoices complete with forged signatures. On the right were the IP address logs showing exactly where those transactions were digitally authorized. That money was stolen from the pockets of the hard-working drivers who physically built this company, I projected, making sure my voice carried to the executives sitting in the back rows. It was stolen to fund an offshore trust in the Cayman Islands. And the person who authorized every single one of those fraudulent wire transfers, the person who holds sole proprietary control over that secret offshore account, is standing right next to me on this stage. I turned my head and looked directly at Bradley. "It was you, Bradley," I stated clearly, letting the microphone pick up every single syllable. "You came into this prominent African-American family playing the role of the wealthy, sophisticated Wall Street savior. You weaponized my mother's obsession with high society status. You used my sister as a legal shield. You patronized me, called me a pathetic bookkeeper, and tried to force me into a psychiatric facility because I was the only person in this family who actually knew how to read a balance sheet. You are not a savior, Bradley. You are a parasite. And you are caught." The ballroom absolutely exploded. The polite, dignified silence of the country club shattered into a deafening roar of absolute chaos. 500 people gasped simultaneously. Women clutched their chests in genuine shock. Wealthy corporate executives, including the grocery chain CEO who had canceled my contract earlier that day, stood up from their tables, their eyes completely glued to the undeniable financial proof glowing on the screen. Cell phones were immediately pulled out of designer purses and tuxedo pockets. Flashes began going off as people started recording the stage. My mother, Vivian, looked as if she had been physically struck by lightning. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth, her perfectly calculated world of optics and social standing collapsing into dust in a matter of seconds. Chloe jumped up from her front row seat, her emerald green gown catching on her chair. She screamed Bradley's name, her face twisted in total frantic confusion. For 3 agonizing seconds, Bradley stood frozen at the center of the stage. The realization that his entire elite privileged existence was being publicly dismantled broke his brain. His massive, fragile ego simply could not process the humiliation. The survival instinct of a cornered predator took over. His face violently shifted from pale gray to a deep, explosive crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk bow tie. "Shut up," Bradley roared, the sound tearing out of his throat with an animalistic fury. He lunged across the stage toward the podium. He did not care that 500 people were watching. He did not care about his tailored tuxedo or his sophisticated image. He aggressively slammed his body against the acrylic podium, knocking me backward with sheer physical force. I stumbled but kept my footing, watching as he desperately grabbed the microphone stand with both hands. "She is completely delusional," Bradley screamed into the microphone, his voice cracking with intense, frantic panic. The audio system screeched with a sharp burst of feedback, causing several guests in the front row to cover their ears. "Do not listen to a single word she is saying. She is having a severe manic episode. The grief has completely shattered her mind." He pointed wildly at the massive forensic map glowing behind us, his chest heaving as he tried to spin the ultimate lie. "Those are not stolen funds. It is a highly specialized wealth management strategy. Apex Global Solutions is a perfectly legal offshore tax shelter. I built it specifically to protect Chloe's inheritance from predatory domestic estate taxes. I am managing the family wealth exactly the way Marcus instructed me to. This is standard corporate procedure. She does not understand high-level finance. She is a low-level accountant who fabricated these documents out of pure spiteful jealousy." He was sweating profusely now. The bright stage lights illuminated the desperate, terrified sweat beading on his forehead. He gripped the microphone so tightly his knuckles were completely white, leaning over the edge of the stage to beg the audience to believe his corporate mansplaining. He thought if he threw enough financial jargon at them, they would revert to trusting the wealthy white executive over the grieving black daughter. But I had not even dropped the real bomb yet. I stood a few feet away from him, completely calm, feeling the heavy silver pendant resting against my chest. Knowing the federal agents were listening to every single desperate, incriminating excuse he just shouted into the public record. I let his desperate voice echo through the massive ballroom and fade into a heavy, suffocating silence. Bradley was panting heavily, glaring out at the crowd as if daring anyone to challenge his brilliant financial mind. He truly believed he had talked his way out of the corner. He thought the wealthy elites in the room would naturally side with the polished hedge fund manager over the grieving, supposedly unstable sister. He was so incredibly confident in his own lies. I raised the small wireless clicker in my right hand, holding it up so he could see it. A wealth management strategy, I repeated into the microphone, my voice dripping with absolute icy contempt. That is a fascinating excuse, Bradley. But tell me, since when do offshore tax shelters have blonde hair and blue eyes? I pressed the button. The massive projector screen behind us flashed violently, wiping away the complex forensic money flow map. In its place, a breathtaking high-resolution photograph filled the entire 20-foot display. The image was completely undeniable. It was Bradley standing on a pristine white sand beach, bathed in golden tropical sunlight. He was wearing a casual linen shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, looking completely relaxed and happier than I had ever seen him. His arms were wrapped tightly around Rebecca, his beautiful blonde secret wife. He was kissing her deeply on the cheek while she laughed, holding a crystal champagne flute. Standing directly in front of them, smiling brightly for the camera, were 3 blonde children, all wearing matching tropical swimwear. I pressed the clicker again, advancing to the next slide before anyone could even take a breath. It was a massive screenshot of Rebecca's public lifestyle blog. The caption below the photograph was magnified, so every single person in the very back row of the ballroom could read it clearly. Celebrating our 10th wedding anniversary and our son Tommy's 8th birthday in Island Paradise. I clicked one more time. The screen split into 3 equal sections. 3 official certified international birth certificates appeared side by side. I had digitally highlighted the section for the father's name in bright glowing yellow ink. Bradley's full legal name, his exact date of birth, and his American passport number were printed clearly on all 3 government documents. The tense silence in the ballroom shattered into a million jagged pieces. The initial shock of the financial embezzlement was absolutely nothing compared to the visceral, explosive reaction to this deeply personal, humiliating betrayal. The room erupted into complete, unadulterated pandemonium. Wealthy socialites gasped so loudly it sounded like all the oxygen was being sucked right out of the room. Men began shouting in utter disbelief. A woman in the 3rd row actually dropped her glass of red wine onto the pristine hardwood floor. The shattering sound totally lost in the massive tidal wave of overlapping frantic voices. I turned my head to look at my sister. Chloe was standing in the front row, her body completely rigid. The smug, triumphant sneer she had worn just 10 minutes ago had been violently wiped from her face. She was staring up at the massive screen, her eyes wide and unblinking, tracking the faces of the 3 children that shared her husband's DNA. Her husband of 4 years. The man she had paraded around our affluent African-American community as her ultimate prize. The man who was supposedly working late nights at the downtown hedge fund to secure her luxurious future. He had been married to a white woman for 10 years. He had an 8-year-old son. He had an entire, fully formed second family, hidden on a tropical island entirely funded by the millions of dollars he stole from our black grandfather. No, Chloe whispered, shaking her head rapidly. Her hands began to tremble. No, this is fake. Naya fabricated this. This is a sick joke. Look at the government seals, Chloe, I said softly into the microphone, forcing her to hear the truth over the roaring crowd. Look at the timestamps. Look at the face of the man standing next to me. Chloe looked away from the screen and locked eyes with Bradley. The polished, arrogant facade of the Wall Street executive had completely disintegrated. The charming, sophisticated gentleman was gone. His face was pale and slick with terrifying sweat. His eyes were wide with the pure, unfiltered panic of a man whose entire existence was crashing down around him. He did not look like a savior. He looked guilty. Chloe let out a sound that I will never forget for the rest of my life. It was not a delicate cry or a sad whimper. It was a guttural, agonizing scream that tore from the very bottom of her soul. It was the horrific sound of a woman whose entire reality, her pride, her marriage, and her social standing had just been violently ripped apart in front of 500 people. She lunged forward, tripping over the heavy hem of her custom emerald green gown, and scrambled up the stage stairs like a wild animal. Bradley spun around as she approached. He raised his hands, stepping backward until his shoulder hit the clear acrylic podium. "Chloe, wait," he stammered, his voice cracking with frantic desperation. "I can explain this. It is not what it looks like. Let me explain." Chloe did not stop to listen to his pathetic lies. She closed the distance between them and swung her arm with every ounce of strength she possessed in her body. The open palm of her hand connected with Bradley's cheek in a brutal, echoing crack that rang loudly through the live microphone system. The massive force of the slaps snapped his head violently to the side. A bright red handprint instantly bloomed across his pale, sweating skin. "You monster!" Chloe screamed, her voice breaking with hysterical, agonizing rage. She began hitting him wildly, her fists pounding aggressively against his chest and his expensive tuxedo shoulders. "You stole my life! You used me! You used my family! You absolutely disgust me!" Bradley's survival instinct kicked in, and the cornered predator truly revealed himself. As Chloe raised her hand to strike him across the face again, Bradley aggressively grabbed both of her wrists. He did not gently restrain his grieving wife. He violently shoved her backward with all of his physical strength. Chloe let out a sharp gasp as her high heels slipped on the polished wooden stage floor. She tumbled backward, hitting the ground hard, the expensive fabric of her designer gown tangling around her legs as she scrambled to catch her balance. The crowd roared in absolute furious outrage. Several wealthy men in the front row, including the elders from our church, immediately rushed forward. They began yelling at Bradley, completely enraged that he had just physically assaulted a woman on a brightly lit stage. The refined country club gala had officially turned into an angry, chaotic mob. I looked past the violent, shouting men on the stage and searched the room for my mother. Vivian had not moved a single inch to help her precious golden child. She was still standing near the catering entrance, but she looked like a completely different person. The regal, composed matriarch, who commanded respect, was entirely gone. Vivian was gripping the edge of a white catering table so tightly her knuckles were translucent. Her chest was heaving in rapid, shallow pants. She was aggressively hyperventilating. She looked frantically around the room, making desperate eye contact with the women from her exclusive country club circle, the influential politicians and the corporate executives she had spent decades trying to impress. But they were no longer looking at her with respect, envy, or sympathy. They were looking at her and her family with absolute unfiltered disgust. They saw the public humiliation. They saw the stolen corporate money. They saw the ultimate pathetic failure of her perfectly curated image. Her blind obsession with high society status had invited a ruthless parasite into her home, and now that parasite was actively destroying her entire legacy on a massive projector screen for the whole city to witness. Vivian's eyes rolled back into her head. Her knees buckled completely beneath her weight. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor in a heavy heap of white designer fabric, her expensive pearl necklace scattering loudly across the ground. Two waitresses rushed to her side, frantically fanning her face and calling for a doctor, but the social damage was permanently done. Her elite standing had evaporated into thin air in a matter of seconds. She would never recover from this public shame. She would never be able to show her face at that church or that country club ever again. Up on the stage, Bradley suddenly realized his situation was rapidly deteriorating from a massive public relations disaster into a highly dangerous, physical confrontation. The men from the audience were climbing the stage stairs, loosening their ties, their faces red with protective anger. Bradley looked at me. His eyes were darting wildly around the massive room, like a trapped rat, desperately looking for a sewer grate to crawl into. "You are going to pay for this, you crazy expletive!" he hissed at me, his voice shaking with pure, unadulterated venom. I just smiled at him, my right hand resting casually over the hidden silver pendant on my chest. "Run, Bradley," I said softly. He turned away from the angry crowd advancing on the podium. He abandoned his crying wife on the floor. He abandoned his carefully crafted Wall Street image. He sprinted toward the back of the massive stage, leaping down the short wooden steps and charging directly toward the swinging kitchen doors. A line of uniformed catering staff carrying heavy silver trays of empty champagne flutes blocked his direct path to the exit. Bradley did not even attempt to slow down. He lowered his shoulder and violently shoved a young waiter out of the way, sending a massive tray of crystal glasses crashing to the floor in a loud, spectacular explosion of shattered glass. He kicked the heavy kitchen doors open with his expensive leather shoes and disappeared into the back service hallways of the country club, desperately trying to reach the rear parking lot before anyone from the angry crowd could stop him. Bradley burst through the heavy metal service doors and stumbled out into the cool night air of the rear parking lot. He was sprinting toward his luxury sports car, desperately digging into his tuxedo pockets for his keys, fully intending to drive straight to the private airstrip. But he never even made it past the dumpster. Suddenly, the heavy darkness of the country club grounds was violently shattered. A blinding array of flashing red and blue lights erupted from every possible angle. The deafening wail of sirens pierced the quiet night. 5 massive black SUVs screeched around the corners of the building, aggressively blocking every single exit route from the parking lot. The heavy doors of the vehicles flew open almost simultaneously. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," a booming voice echoed through a heavy megaphone. "Stop right there. Do not move." Bradley froze like a deer in headlights. More than a dozen FBI special agents from the white-collar crime division swarmed the parking lot, their tactical vests clearly illuminated by the strobe lights. Special Agent Thomas led the charge, his weapon drawn, and pointed directly at the sweating, panicked hedge fund manager. Bradley raised his hands, shaking violently, but the sheer adrenaline and terror made him take one panicked step backward. He slipped on the damp asphalt. Before he could even regain his footing, 2 heavily armed agents charged forward and tackled him straight to the ground. The expensive fabric of his custom-tailored tuxedo tore loudly against the rough concrete. The agents aggressively pinned his arms behind his back, pressing his cheek directly into the dirt. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs, locking around his wrists, echoed clearly over the blaring sirens. "Bradley, you are under federal arrest for massive corporate embezzlement, international wire fraud, and money laundering," Agent Thomas announced, standing over him with a look of absolute professional satisfaction. "You have the right to remain silent, which I strongly suggest you do, since you already confessed to every single charge on a live federal wiretap." Inside the massive ballroom, the chaos had ground to a sudden, terrified halt. The 500 elite guests stood frozen, watching the frantic, flashing red and blue lights reflecting brightly against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. They could hear the shouting outside. They knew exactly what was happening. The wealthy, untouchable Wall Street executive was being hauled away in chains. I stood alone on the main stage, the bright projector screen still illuminating the room with the undeniable proof of his crimes. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the heavy adrenaline slowly begin to drain from my veins. The war was officially over. I had won. I reached up and gently touched the silver pendant resting against my collarbone, knowing the federal agents outside had heard every single moment of my victory. I looked down at the floor of the stage. Lying right near the clear acrylic podium was the thick stack of legal transfer contracts completely unsigned. Resting right on top of them was the cheap blue plastic pen my sister had mockingly handed me. I did not bend down to pick them up. I stepped straight off the edge of the podium, planting my high heel directly onto the center of the paper, leaving a sharp, permanent indentation right over the signature line. I walked down the stage stairs and stepped onto the main ballroom floor. The crowd of wealthy socialites, corporate executives, and church elders immediately parted down the center, creating a wide, silent path for me to walk through. Nobody whispered. Nobody glared. They simply watched me with a newfound terrifying respect. As I neared the exit, I felt a weak, trembling hand grab my wrist. It was my mother, Vivian. She had managed to pull herself up from the floor, leaning heavily against a catering table. Her pristine white designer gown was wrinkled and stained. Her perfect hair was a chaotic mess. Her eyes were wide with pure, desperate panic. "Nia, please," Vivian choked out, her voice barely a raspy whisper. "You have to fix this. Call your lawyers. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. If the federal government seizes the company, we will lose everything. The house, the club, the accounts. You have to save our family." I stopped and looked at her. I looked at the woman who had watched me get publicly humiliated, who had threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward, who had prioritized a wealthy white thief over her own black daughter. I gently but firmly peeled her trembling fingers off my wrist. "I am saving my family. Vivian," I said softly, staring directly into her cold, panicked eyes. "I am saving my grandfather's legacy from you." I turned my back on her and pushed through the heavy oak doors of the ballroom. I walked out into the cool, chaotic night, my head held high, leaving the ruins of their perfect society completely behind me. 6 months have passed since that night at the country club. The transition was not easy, but the truth is a powerful foundation to build on. Bradley did not even try to fight the federal charges. Once the prosecutors presented the wiretap recording and the offshore data logs, his expensive corporate lawyers immediately advised him to take a plea deal. He is currently serving a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. Chloe filed for divorce the very next morning. However, she quickly discovered that the prenuptial agreement she signed 4 years ago was a predatory trap. Bradley had explicitly insulated all of his assets, leaving her with absolutely nothing. Her designer bags were sold off to pay her massive credit card debt. My mother Vivian suffered an equally harsh reality check. Her beloved country club permanently revoked her membership the Monday after the gala. Without the massive corporate payouts she had grown accustomed to, she could not maintain the mortgage on her sprawling estate. The bank foreclosed on the property just 2 months later. I was sitting in my newly expanded corporate office overlooking the Atlanta skyline when the heavy glass doors swung open. Vivian and Chloe stood in the doorway. They looked exhausted, completely stripped of their designer clothes and their staggering arrogance. Behind them, they dragged 3 battered suitcases. "Nia, please," my mother started, her voice breaking as she walked toward my desk. "We have absolutely nowhere else to go. The banks took everything. You have your grandfather's entire empire now. You have to help us. We are your blood. We are family." Chloe stood behind her, crying silently, looking at me with the desperate eyes of a woman who had finally realized she was never the golden child, just a pawn in a scam. I looked at both of them. I did not feel angry. I did not feel the need to yell or scream or validate my victory. I just felt a deep, overwhelming sense of peace. I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a single crisp piece of paper. I slid it across the polished mahogany surface. "This is the address to a low-income apartment complex on the outskirts of the city," I said, keeping my voice completely calm and level. "I have paid the first month of rent and the security deposit. This is my last handout. You need to find jobs. Do not call my office and do not show up here again. You are no longer my family." I watched them pick up the piece of paper, their hands shaking before turning around and dragging their luggage out of my life forever. As I sit here today in my living room taking a slow sip of my wine, I realize that sometimes the hardest calculation you will ever make is figuring out exactly when to cut your losses with the people who share your last name. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you, and you cannot build an empire while letting parasites drain your foundation. Have you ever had to draw a hard line and completely cut off toxic family members to save your own sanity and future? Let me know your experiences in the comments below. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Remember, true family is built on respect, not just biology.